without further ado, I'll hand it over to Maggie. Well, hello everyone. It's such an honor to be here to kick off the new SCARP seminar series with all of you here. So thanks for being here, and thanks to Julia for getting this going. So I'm Maggie Low. I'm an assistant professor here at SCARP. I'm also the co-chair of the Indigenous Community Planning program with the wonderful Sandercock. A little bit about myself. I have mixed Indigenous and European ancestry. I was born and raised in Sudbury, Ontario, and I'm a status member of the Kwamakwamakwintia territory on Manitoulin Island in the beautiful Northern Ontario. And I'm here today to talk about urban Indigenous housing in BC, which is a topic that's becoming very interesting and important to me and to many others, of course. And I presented on this topic at the Association of Collegiate Schools of Planning this past November. And so the title of the talk is Municipal Planning Responsive to Urban Indigenous Housing Needs, an examination of housing plans and policies in British Columbia. So this research I'm presenting today was conducted with Cleo Breton, who's a recent graduate of ICP, a SCARPy, and is now a brilliant social planner at the City of Surrey. And it was also conducted in partnership with the Aboriginal Housing and Management Association, known as AHMA. So just a little bit about AHMA. AHMA is an Indigenous organization here in BC that helps lead and advance housing rights for all Indigenous people in the province. AHMA is an umbrella organization of about 41 Indigenous nonprofit housing providers in the province, and AHMA works closely with BC municipalities and the province and the provincial government through BC Housing to advocate on behalf of Indigenous communities and influence housing policy and plans. So the aim of this research that I'm going to talk about today is to shed light on whether and how urban Indigenous housing needs are identified and addressed by local and regional governments here in BC. And the bulk of this research was conducted by Cleo and myself from June 2020 to February 2021 with the generous support of AHMA, UBC Housing Collaborative, and MyTax. So, in this presentation today, I'm going to briefly provide a context, set the stage, and the research question, and this will be followed by the approach that we used, a few of our results, some key takeaways, and then an example of how municipal staff have been integrating Indigenous identified housing needs into their planning processes and report, and then a couple of closing thoughts. So, to set the stage, many of you might know this, especially if you've taken any of my classes, but in Canada and in the province of British Columbia, the recognition of Indigenous rights, sovereignty has increased at all levels of government. So even within the last 2 years, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People has been adopted at both the federal level and the provincial level. So of course, at the provincial level, we have the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, DRIPA. So this new legislation, as well as the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's 94 calls to action, is seemingly and hopefully leading to major shifts for policymakers and planners, particularly over the next few years. That's the hope, anyway. And this is also happening, of course, as the profession and discipline and education of planning is grappling with its role the role that it has played and continues to play in the colonial project and understanding what it means to plan on Indigenous stolen land. At the same time, Canada is also undergoing an affordability or housing affordability crisis, and within the last 5 to 10 years, a significant amount of federal, provincial, and even regional government resources has actually gone into a response, such as the National Housing Strategy released in 2019, which was the first of its kind. Whether or not these responses, how they're working, is another line of research. So these pieces, along with the rapid increase of Indigenous folks moving to and making permanent homes in urban areas, is changing the housing context for municipalities and planners, and has highlighted the need for municipalities to foster better working relationships with local First Nations and urban Indigenous folks, or the urban Indigenous diaspora. So folks that have moved from their communities to the state. So while all levels of Canadian governments have seemingly been working to address housing, there's historically been a jurisdictional gap in responding to urban Indigenous housing and urban Indigenous housing needs. So urban Indigenous housing providers and advocates such as AHMA, the Aboriginal Housing Management Association, have been responding to urban Indigenous housing needs for quite some time, and they do know what is needed for their communities. And just so for the purposes of this study, urban Indigenous housing needs are the housing needs of individuals who identify as Indigenous and now live within municipalities' jurisdictional boundary. So as the researchers, Cleo and I, believe that municipalities in BC are actually well positioned to play an important role in supporting urban Indigenous housing needs and addressing these needs. Municipalities ideally know the local and specific contexts, considerations, and goals of the communities that live there, more so than the provincial and federal governments. And of course, municipalities are responsible for planning decisions pertinent to housing, such as zoning, permitting, bylaws, as well as a host of other policies. Also, interestingly, municipalities were recently mandated by the provincial government to produce housing needs reports. And this mandate asked municipalities to complete these reports by April 2022, so this was a year ago, as well, and every 5 years after. And these reports are meant to identify housing needs that will then inform official community plans and housing strategies. So AHMA was curious, how, if at all, are municipalities in BC addressing urban Indigenous housing in official community plans and housing strategies? So just a quick note that our research paid close attention to what, or our research approach paid close attention to what ETAC has called damage-centered research. And this is research that focuses on the hardships and pain experienced by Indigenous communities in order to obtain particular political gains, which can simultaneously reinforce this one-dimensional notion of a people that are depleted and ruined and hopeless. But we're hoping to do the exact opposite with this research and instead make visible power imbalances and to highlight the expertise and knowledge of urban Indigenous organizations, especially in the creation of housing policies and plans. So one way, as a way of understanding municipal responses to urban Indigenous housing, we chose to look at official community plans and housing strategies kind of for two main reasons. The first is that these are two of the main policy documents in which municipalities actually articulate their understanding of the local housing context, and it's where they prioritize their resources and provide direction to the development community and planning staff. And two, almost every community in BC is required to have an OCP under the Local Governments Act. So in BC, there are 162 municipalities and 27 regional districts. This study used a sample of 39 small, medium, and large regionally dispersed municipalities across the province. The sample size is 39 because we chose municipalities that had official community plans and housing strategies that were adopted after January 1st, 2015. And the reason why we chose that date is because it was after the release of the TRC's calls to action. So we made the assumption that the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action might actually motivate changes to official community plans. So trends in urban Indigenous housing experiences identified through a literature review were used to build an initial coding framework to conduct a content analysis of the sample official community plans and housing strategies. And then we also obtained survey and interview data from municipal planning staff from many of the municipalities. And these planning staff had direct experience working on or had an in-depth knowledge of the processes undertaken to create their municipality's official community plan for housing strategy. So what did we find? Perhaps unsurprisingly, we, and specifically from the content analysis of the OCPs and strategies, Language directly related to urban Indigenous housing needs was quite rare in these documents. So just to go through a few of the numbers. So 4 out of 39 municipal documents, OCPs and housing strategies, explicitly acknowledge that there are distinct urban Indigenous housing needs, while 5 out of 39 municipal documents recognized Indigenous people among other marginalized groups, which implicitly suggests there are Indigenous-specific housing needs. And 3 out of 39 documents contained a policy to develop or support the development of culturally appropriate housing for Indigenous people. We found the most common way Indigenous content is articulated in official community plans and housing strategies is by Indigenous territory being acknowledged and language around the intent to build better relationships with local First Nations, not necessarily the urban diaspora. From the survey responses, we found that 9 out of 24 responses indicated Indigenous housing needs were considered in the creation of their latest OCP or housing strategy, but it seems like considering these needs doesn't necessarily mean that they make it into the final plan. Importantly, in 2 municipalities, significant Indigenous specific content only existed in their strategies to end homelessness. So while it is critical to recognize and address the overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples experiencing homelessness, it is important to question why the urban Indigenous population was only acknowledged in relation to interventions for those experiencing or at risk of experiencing homelessness. We did find that municipal planners, of course, many are keen to understand and respond to urban Indigenous housing needs and believe official community plans and housing strategies are one of the possible ways to address these needs. So just a few quotes from the survey data and the interview data. So we heard things like, it's really a tangible way for the district to take steps towards reconciliation and strengthen that relationship with Indigenous communities, because housing is a common challenge for Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. And there's one other quote up on the screen as well that talks about how it's important actually for urban Indigenous housing needs to be embedded directly in the OCP. However, there is significant work to be done to move from this intention described here to actually addressing urban Indigenous housing needs in these documents. So, for example, less than half of the survey respondents, 10 out of 23, had or were intending to distinguish urban Indigenous housing needs in their housing needs reports, which is the information or data that municipalities need to use when developing their OCPs and housing strategies. So this part is also interesting. So we also, through the survey data, asked municipal planners what they thought or experienced as the challenges to addressing these needs. So some of the things that came up in the surveys were things like there's an uncertainty of the municipality's role or jurisdiction to actually engage on Indigenous issues or take action to address Indigenous housing needs. There's uncertainty on whether needs are unique or could be covered in responses for the general population. There were limited resources, of course, time, staff capacity, financial resources. There was lack of direction from council to identify urban Indigenous housing needs. And in some cases, planners actually didn't know that urban Indigenous housing needs was actually a thing or something that needed to be addressed. So one of the key takeaways is that there is still a clear lack of understanding on the part of municipal planners and policymakers about Indigenous history, Indigenous rights, Indigenous laws, generally Indigenous state relations in Canada. But that's okay because many are now here taking my class. There's also an assumption held that addressing needs for an entire population will produce mutual responses to community housing needs. And this assumption ignores the settler colonial history of Canada and privileges Western ideas and understandings of housing. So, for example, the belief that home ownership or a single family dwelling are what everyone desires. This doesn't necessarily match with Indigenous concepts of housing and home. So there's been a lot of research around Indigenous conceptions of housing and home. One in particular has shown that Indigenous notions of home, health, and even place have been found to be qualitatively distinct from non-Indigenous peoples in many respects. So, for example, Indigenous housing and home can include important considerations of access to wraparound supports, intergenerational living spaces, and access and connections to culture and community. These are just to name a few. Notably, of course, political support is key in addressing urban Indigenous housing needs. Support, and more importantly, mandates and resources from elected officials and decision makers will enable and direct planners to undertake the work of identifying urban Indigenous housing needs. It is encouraging to see interview participants expressing desire to work with urban Indigenous leadership and local First Nations to understand urban Indigenous housing needs. That work is happening. Importantly, municipalities are recognizing the need, and they need to recognize that they're not, while they're well positioned to address these needs in their official community plans, they have to strike a balance. They're not necessarily well positioned to speak on behalf of the urban Indigenous community. And so identifying what these needs are and to really understand them is going to take new processes, and it's going to take time, and it's going to take new processes of engagement. Also, housing needs for urban Indigenous folks will most likely look different across different municipalities. But there's good news. Importantly, AHMA offers guidance on how municipalities can take action on this work and on reconciliation broadly, including ensuring meaningful engagement and participation that recenters Indigenous wisdom to help transform the systems. So where housing needs have been identified, and there has been good work out there where they are, good relationships between the municipalities and urban Indigenous organizations was essential to this work. So I'm just going to close this the talk by talking about a hopeful, a positive example. So in the city of Surrey, the Surrey Urban Indigenous Leadership Committee, SILC, conducted a housing lab to identify urban Indigenous housing needs in Surrey. And I'm just going to take one more water. And the process that was used to identify these needs included robust community engagement, embedded in Indigenous wisdom and methodology, and it was guided by a task force with members from AHMA, Indigenous housing providers in Surrey, and all levels of government. So when Surrey planning staff wanted to include urban Indigenous housing needs in their housing needs reports, again, those reports are now mandated, rather than try to duplicate engagement processes, the city supported SILC in crafting an Indigenous statement of need for that report. So in this way, the urban Indigenous community in Surrey actually had more control over how urban Indigenous housing needs were identified and communicated in their municipal plan. So in closing, although there is a keenness and interest from municipal planners, urban Indigenous housing needs are not yet being considered in a significant way in policy development and housing plans, which is disappointing. But there is good work going on, and we need to see more of that good work. We believe municipalities are well positioned to support Indigenous-led solutions to Indigenous identified needs in their OCPs and housing strategies. And perhaps more broadly, this is also a way for municipalities to actually demonstrate their commitments to reconciliation. So this study is just the beginning. There's a lot more interesting questions that could be asked and data to be collected. So future research questions could be something like, how can municipalities support Indigenous-led and Indigenous-informed processes that uphold Indigenous rights in pursuit of better housing outcomes for Indigenous people? Also, how is systemic racism and colonial values still informing or embedded in municipal responses to urban Indigenous housing needs? And Indigenous organizations and communities, they know their own housing needs and goals, and how to achieve them to support their own well-being. And so to this end, AHMA has actually indicated there's a need for a tool, like a tool that local governments and even beyond can use to help gather the data that's needed to articulate what Indigenous housing needs are, with the goal of including this gathered data and these articulated needs in municipalities' housing needs reports. So I'm currently working with a team of researchers at UBC to seek support, financial support through the Indigenous Strategic Initiatives Fund to try to continue to work with AHMA and Indigenous housing providers to collaborate on what the design of such a unique tool could look like that captures a for Indigenous by Indigenous housing needs sort of approach. So stay tuned for that work. Thank you very much for listening.